Good evening, everyone. Good evening, all. Can everybody hear me? And a very warm welcome indeed to Wits Business School. I'm the freshly minted director of the school. I've been here just 1 month now. One month, yes. So a very warm welcome indeed. And I'm delighted, we were delighted on behalf of the school to be hosting this auspicious occasion today. Chaired by Lord Haynes, sister, I refer to him as Peter Haynes. And he's also insisted that every member of this illustrious panel is going to speak for no more than 5 minutes. They've protested vehemently that he's being extremely tyrannical. But nonetheless, the circumstances dictate that this be so. We are, the past 24 hours have been, what's the word? So.
Can you hear at the back? Yes. At the back.
Okay, I'll just raise my voice. Can you hear now?
Hold the microphone close.
Good. Thank you. Past 24 hours have been eventful, to say the least. I'll leave it to the illustrious panel here to find a more fitting epithet. But I'd like, I tend to, when one thinks of periods of development, building hope, rebuilding optimism, and building the future, I tend to think literally of an analogy of a construction site, where you lay a foundation and build it further. Maybe the exercise of building hope, of optimism, is certainly beyond the stage of a mere foundation. And if it were a literal building, I suppose there'd be a sign saying under rapid construction. And any sign that normally accompanies construction sites of that nature, such as keep out, men at work, would have been cast aside contemptuously a long time ago, and you could say, everyone welcome, and please don't let me stretch the analogy too far. Don't ask me who the health and safety officer would be in such circumstances. Analogies do all break down and flex too far. But let me immediately call upon, without further ado, the chair, Peter Haynes, who will conduct the proceeding and introduce the speaker. Yet another illustrious member of the panel.
Apologies for being late.
Well, I did not oversleep. I slept rather prematurely. And when I woke up and was told what had happened, I felt rather like Rip Van Winkle. But mercifully, I've not yet slept 20 years, so allow me to enjoy my
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I'm privileged to be a visiting professor at Wits Business School, where I'm actually allowed to teach the students. And in the last few months, I've had a sense of deja vu. I've been called Hayne the Pain, which is certainly what I was called when I was organizing disruptions of all-white Springbok tours in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I was not very popular in the white community here. And I was delighted to be on the receiving end of ferocious Zupta bots on Twitter, who repeatedly told me Futsek Which is ironic because during the Stop the Tour campaigns, I was repeatedly told by British rugby and cricket fans to go back home. So I'm a little facing an identity crisis. Now, this evening, with an expert panel, is meant to be a call for action. And you'll have in front of you this document, Ideas for Action, which has been drawn up with a range of key NGOs, Corruption Watch, Amabungadi. By the way, Susan is not able to be with us this evening because she's been hospitalized with asthma, so we wish her well. Also, Forensics for Justice, OUTA, are also part of all of this and are present here this evening. And then we've had other experts from Wits Business School contributing to this panel and to the document. So what it is an ideas for action. And I hope that as a result of tonight, you'll go away with a better idea of an agenda to take forward in this country under the new government. Before introducing the panel, I just want to give three messages. First of all, veterans of the freedom struggle like Mavuso Misimang, and it's great having you here this evening, Mavuso. Veterans of the freedom struggle did not sacrifice so much to have their legacy looted. And together we've got to reclaim the values of the freedom struggle, of integrity, of good governance, of equality, of social justice, and democracy and human rights. So that's the first point. Second is, and this is more in my area, any British or global corporate must have nothing to do with corruption and whitewashing corruption or getting fat fees from the looters. And I just want to say to Hogan Lovells this evening, we will continue to target you relentlessly until you admit what the others have to be dragged to admit that you do. And the third point is I want to salute civil society in South Africa. The organizations that I've mentioned already that have been absolutely tireless and fearless on the anti-corruption agenda, tracking people down and prosecuting them like Forensics for Justice have done, and Paul O'Sullivan's here in the audience, and we're delighted to have you, Paul. But also, the business community has come to the agenda, perhaps late in the day, and it's great to see you. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's great to see you here. But
I never trust these blacks.
I knew somebody would put me in my place, and he hasn't even spoken properly yet. Civil society, it seems to me, are the heroes of the hour. It is civil society, it is the independent media, it is also the parts of the business community like Business Leadership South Africa that have actually ensured that the ANC got a new leader to take the country forward. And you know, I think that that result was so close in December that were it not for the Daily Mavericks and the Amabunganis and the Scorpios and the Mail and Guardian and all the rest of them, and the tireless work of the NGOs involved and present here this evening, we would have got a different result. As a one South African is now, as it were, an external observer and sort of semi-participant, I would say, and I would hope that the new government would work with civil society, closely with civil society, and make sure that we can tackle this problem together. And I hope that that will be done under our new president. I want to give apologies for Pravin Gordon. He's got affairs of state to attend to in Cape Town and phoned me up to apologise. I didn't expect it this morning. I did expect it this morning. I mentioned Mavuso. He's also chair of Corruption Watch. Ishmael Monmiat, we're expecting, who's Deputy General of the Treasury, we're expecting he's in traffic at the moment, any moment. Sarah Jane Trent from Forensics for Justice. Sarah Jane was actually kidnapped for a whole weekend, wasn't it? By a rogue part of the Hawks. We have Tara O'Connor from Africa Risk Consulting, Professor Carlo Oja, from Wits Business School on the finance side, and of course Bonang Mohali that I've already introduced as he skipped unobtrusively onto the platform. We're going to start this evening, Mabuso, with you to set the context. And as I say earlier on, I've been accused of being tyrannical. I hold up one of these and 1 minute left, and when they have to stop, they have to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. He holds 1 minute left before I even rise. We all have, South Africans, gone through 2 tumultuous weeks, during which the African National Congress, after 9 years of neglect, decided that it was time to take on their president and call him to account. So we had a SONA meeting postponed. We had a scheduled National Executive Committee postponed. We had night meetings that lasted 8 hours more. And in the end, Jacob Zuma, in a rather sorry tone, decided that he would resign after all. So we have a new era now, in which Cyril Ramaphosa has been appointed president. It all happened in Nasrec in December last year, when Cyril Ramaphosa scraped through with the narrowest of margins. Perhaps that's the incentive that he would have needed in order to do what he has to do. I think had he had the 2/3 majority that Zuma had, he might have been lulled into thinking that everything is all right. He's aligned with some strange bedfellows in the top 6 structure. It was supposed to be a re-election of an election of the leadership. Well, 40% more of the culprits of the past were re-elected. So that's the stuff that he has got to work with. He is extremely lucky in that the judiciary, without really any overreach and with no incitement to do anything, just coincidentally, assisted Cyril Ramaphosa and progressive people by making sure that provinces, 2 of them, that had elected people illegally, were not allowed to go forward with those elections. Had that happened, we might be talking a different story today. So this was no conspiracy. Let's make that very clear. But Cyril now has his work very cut out for him. What he has said correctly is that he'll focus on 2 things more. But corruption is a key issue, because that's what characterized the ANC of the past 9 years under Jacob Zuma. You couldn't want to change anything in the ANC if you're not going to change corruption. Good statement. He wants to do something about the economy. It has stagnated. It's gone into junk status. Unemployment rates are at the highest they have been since democracy. All of those things require a very, very quick intervention. How does he tackle, in practical terms, corruption? You must not confuse 2 things. By the way, it's very important that he should build the ANC. He must build party unity. I do believe, by the way, with due apologies to anybody else who may think differently, that a soundly functioning ANC would be the best organization, party to run this country. I've put in a caveat, so I hope that. So, unity for the ANC is the only thing that will keep Cyril Ramaphosa afloat. But the unity must not be conflated with making common cause with corruption. There is a huge difference between the 2. If he had my ear, or it is the other way around. If I had his ear, it doesn't need much. 1 minute. I would say to him, if you want to become president of South Africa, which I'm sure he wants to do, make sure that you don't make common cause with anybody who was involved in state capture, with anybody who has been identified with corruption within the party, whether they are friends of Zuma or not. That's what it should be. Next thing is there are new frontiers now for democracy. You will not run this country unless you make a common alliance with the NGOs. Without them, I tell you, we wouldn't be where we are. Thank you.
Brilliant, Babu, so exactly 5 minutes. Sarah Jane Trent from Forensics for Justice.
They're requiring Zuma-san to come inside. Hey Jay, come out of the seat.
I think we'll take a calculated risk on this, but suggest that people immediately below just move sideways. Okay? Yeah. Right, Sarah Jane, sorry about that.
Thought that might be a sign. I'm Sarah Jane Trent. I'm Executive Director of Forensics for Justice, not-for-profit organization. And in 2015, it was founded by Paul O'Sullivan to expose corruption within organs of state, and especially the criminal justice system. A few weeks later, our offices were raided by police under General Munu, using a fraudulently obtained search warrant. On 26 February 2016, Forensics for Justice opened a criminal docket of corruption against General Paklane. The Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which by then had been captured, with the assistance of leading law firm Hogan Lovells, refused to investigate the case despite the abundance of prima facie evidence. On the 1st of April 2016, Paul O'Sullivan was dragged off a plane with his 2 small children. He was unlawfully detained and tortured for 4 days. His crime was that he publicly declared that he was flying to London to call a media briefing to expose the fact that the South African criminal justice system had been captured by Zuma Gupta-linked criminals. On Friday, 10 February 2017, at a little after 4 p.m., I was kidnapped from my office by the Paklane accomplices. I was held in the back of a car with cable ties and driven around for hours. Hours later, did my family and my legal team actually find out where I was. I was at some urban police station about an hour out of Johannesburg. My human rights were violated. My kidnappers kept my location a secret, and I was only released on a Sunday night on an urgent High Court application. The very next day, Paul O'Sullivan was unlawfully arrested and detained. This sounds like apartheid-era policing. I think it is. Forensics for Justice have a name for this. It's the capture of the criminal justice system. Jacob Zuma, his family and friends looted this country and nearly brought it to its knees. These people not only captured South Africa's largest state-owned companies, SAA, Transnet, Eskom, Prasa, etc., they also captured many organs of state. Forensics for Justice can show that the plan was hatched in early 2014 to take over the criminal justice system, and this plan was completed in late 2015. If you own the criminal justice system, you can commit crimes with impunity. The state capturers needed flexible professionals to help them pull off the global heist of the millennium. Bell Pottinger, KPMG, McKinsey's, Hogan Lovells, SAP, HSBC, and last but by no means least, ENS Africa, who protected corrupt SAA chair Dudu Myeni, who not only triggered Nene Gate, but also assisted in the capture of Eskom with her son Telete Myeni, Nick Linnell, and her son's father Jacob Zuma. Forensics for Justice proposed a 3-pillared approach. The first, a Nuremberg-style court with dedicated court and judges, being an annex of the Specialized Commercial Crime Court, with dedicated team of police conducting prosecutorial-led investigations. The President can actually appoint a Special Director of Public Prosecutions to do this. 2, asset recovery process, and 3, a media strategy to keep the public informed. Forensics for Justice therefore proposed that these companies become part of the solution and a multidisciplinary team be formed. These people help the perpetrators get this country into the mess it is in. Now they can help us get us out of the mess. In the 3 years of Forensics for Justice, we have spent more than 7 million rand. During the same period, we have received public donations of only 400,000 rand. Yet those that caused the need for Forensics for Justice have collectively banked hundreds of millions of rands in consulting fees. And it's time those that got South Africa into this mess came to the table.
Well, no pressure on the rest of the panel, but Sarah Jane was actually under the 5 minutes. Right, my next speaker is Professor Kalu Oja, who's head of finance at Wits Business School and the deputy director of the school as well. Very welcome, Kalu.
The saying goes, an illness well diagnosed is half cured. We are talking about money laundering. The question is, where does the soiled money come from? And we all generally will, at a high level, say it's from corruption. What causes corruption? What are the antecedents of corruption? And how do those antecedents relate to the South African situation or most African and European country situation? First, where you have ethnic or racial fractionalization, you're likely to have corruption or corrupt activities by individuals, companies, and governments. We are crying about Jacob Zuma because he highlighted the excesses of government corrupt activities. If you look at the illicit flows that have gone out of South Africa, the bulk of it has gone through companies, not through government. So you have transfer pricing as illicit flow. Most of the revenue that the country should get and use to push development is frittered away through transfer pricing. We have two platforms through which money laundering takes place. It's through transfer pricing and through the banks. It's easy or easier for you to pursue activities in financial institutions and track which of the institution is laundering money. The second problem has to do with distributional problems. Countries where you have high inequality, you have us against them, and the tendency will be for there to be class protection. What happens is easier for the ones that are better educated and better informed to again corner shared wealth of the people for themselves. That has to be addressed. And thirdly, where you have legal infrastructure and governance infrastructure weakened or weak, it's also easy for corrupt activities to take place. So these three major antecedents of corruption have to be addressed in the South African case going forward. I am looking forward after Zuma, because it has happened before Zuma, got proliferated under Zuma, it's going to continue if we do not address these three key drivers. One of the fundamental ways of addressing them, the first, around the discussional issues, we talk about education. Students literally forced the government to realize that there was a block, a significant block of the South African population that was left out of the education system. You're going to keep having distributional issues if you don't bring them up to speed. Education, free education, obviously, to some extent, not forever, would be one of the ways of addressing that in a very significant way. Second, around weak institutional infrastructure. South Africa has fantastic rules and laws in the books. They have to be implemented, enforced. Otherwise, nothing would happen. One that comes in and has the personality of Zuma and can charm you will again charm the judiciary system, the court system. And finally, the transformation programs that have been put in place, some of them are very good transformation programs. Again, they need to be implemented to get society to a place where majority of the people feel they belong. Thank you.
Tell you what, Kalu, I've never heard an academic be so succinct. Our next panelist, and we've been joined by Ismail Mohammed. Great to have you here from the South African Treasury Director, Deputy Director General. Our next speaker is Tara O'Connor, who does an amazing job for Africa Risk Consulting. We're really pleased to have you on the panel as well, Tara.
And the reason I'm here really is because I have a background going back 25 years of actually following corporates across Africa, but also advising and working with the private sector, with corporates to help them invest in non-corrupt ways, and then including in some of the most corrupt countries across the continent. And well, it's Africa Risk Consulting, so I deal mainly with the continent. But also to then, once they're up and running, to help them operate within international law and to have processes and policies in place that help them operate cleanly and safely. But I really want to talk about, to use my 5 minutes, to talk about 3 things that I think are essential going forward and from lessons learned of the last 9 years. And the most important one, I think, is to reinstitute the independent crack investigations unit, the Scorpions, that was one of the first, I think, what was, its destruction led the way to the impunity and failure to investigate. The sort of Hawks raid that you saw yesterday morning was a regular occurrence when the Scorpions were around. And I think it's absolutely essential that for the future we learn some lessons from that and reinstitute them. The second is, I think, one of the very key instruments in actually the battle against corruption is the extraterritorial legislation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and now recently the UK Bribery Act, which was promulgated in 2011. And has proved incredibly effective in getting corporates to behave themselves. And the final point that I'd like to talk to, if I get to it but may not, is the role of private organisations, private investigations organisations in supporting government to actually reach out and curb and investigate, identify assets and asset trace and bring that money back. So turning to my first point, I think the lesson learned of losing the Scorpions is completely apparent in it provided a whole avenue for state capture. But I think one of the other lessons that need to be learned about that is a very clear mandate, and it needs a very clear mandate so that the Scorpions or whatever follows it doesn't become a law unto itself, that it has a clear mandate. But the critical lesson of the last 9 years is that the executive power, it should be sufficiently independent of executive power, have a considerable independence so that it can't be so easily destroyed or rendered toothless. The second area, I think, of having worked on sort of major corruption investigations in other countries, a second lesson that I think is a very important one is that it should be relatively self-financing, either self-financing or have a secure budget. because one of the key ways of stopping corruption investigations is, of course, to manipulate the funds, or to suddenly not make funds available, as I think Thuli Madonsela found to her detriment. And so those are two things. I think the US SEC, the US investigators, regulators, provide a very good model for this, in that they those who are found to be corrupt actually pay for the investigations, and the regulators are actually allowed to levy fines, which helps them to be independent of government. And I know that I have Lord Hayne here, so I have to be a bit careful what I say, but one of the big problems about investigating corruption in the UK is the fact that the SFO, I'm on 1 minute, you see, I didn't get to the SFO has problems in terms of its regular budgeting and its actual, its security of its future. The 1 minute, so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act is a critical act. It takes the FCPA much further in that it bans a whole load of more things. That's me telling myself I have to stop. So the UK Bribery Act not only bans the giving of bribes, but it bans the receiving of bribes, which is an extension to an important extension.
Tara, thanks very much. That was great. Before I bring Ismail in for his 5 minutes, is you're saying that South Africa should legislate for something equivalent to the Bribery Act or the US equivalent?
Yes, I think it provides a I think the extraterritorial nature of both of those acts has a very good impact
meaning what?
The sort of the outside of America nature. So if you have a director who is an American national, or well, in fact, even if you use the US dollar on a regular basis, you are actually subject to the FCPA and its provision. So it means that wherever you operate in the world, you are bound by US anti-corruption law. By exactly the same token, the UK Bribery Act is much more stringent and much stricter, but it also applies beyond the borders of the UK. And it applies to wherever any director, any UK director of any company anywhere is bound by the UK Bribery Act. And I do think that would be an effective means of, it's a great means of making sure that your own corporates are behaving with probity when they're operating abroad.
So, for example, just to take this forward, a very valuable point. So, for example, when I was a non-executive director, I no longer am, but when I was in London, of a London-listed company, if something had been done by a junior member of the company in Côte d'Ivoire, even if you didn't know about it, if there was a bit of bribery and kickbacks going on, you could be prosecuted in London.
Absolutely.
So this is extremely tough.
It's a very tough
And
law.
I think South Africa should look at that, which is really what you're saying.
Absolutely agree.
Right. Well, a perfect entree for the Deputy Director General of the Treasury, Ismail. Delighted to have you here. It's fantastic that we've now got a potential for a Treasury to be used in a really positive way to hunt down some of these looted billions. So we hope you're going to tell us about that.
Thanks, Peter. Then you need to give me more than 5 minutes. Give them more. I think, first then, I won't deal with the need for your criminal justice system to work and to act without fear or favor. I think the bigger question is, why didn't they act before? Why did they only start acting yesterday? And certainly getting the culture and the accountability systems right. And I think aside from getting the culture right, the problem is politics does shape what people do, and most people fall in line with the politicians. So like somebody said, just like it's hard to find anyone against apartheid, it's hard to find anyone against state capture today. I mean, that's what's going to happen, I would predict. I don't want to focus therefore on the prosecuting side. I think that I agree with everything that was said by earlier, just before me, and I think that those things need to be done and they need to work. However, I also think that we need to ask hard questions. What are the preventive systems that we have? Why didn't they work? Why didn't the internal audit units work? Why didn't the audit committees work? Why didn't the auditors see it? And I promise you, the auditors looked hard enough, they would have found, but it was too lucrative to act. So one needs to look at all those measures and see how we can change the culture of all these institutions, all these professions, so that if they don't act, they will be struck off and they can't practice, or there's really some sanctions. And of course, in our country, I think it's been extremely frustrating in the Treasury. Yes, we may have not seen things early enough on state capture, but when we did see it, you would really get fired if you acted. So there's reports on the dairy farm, there's reports on the poor procurement practices, the GETA and so on at ESCOM, yet you couldn't act because the man at the top didn't want to act and would fire people. I mean, the most incredible thing is this. You have Deputy Minister Jonas saying, I've been offered this post. And the President, I believe, not calling him up once to say, what happened? And not taking any interest, if it happened, that someone's undermining his authority. So the fact that if people don't ask questions, be it the President, the regulators, the prosecuting agencies, because when we've had discussions, people say, no, nobody's laid charges, nobody's done this. It's in all the damn newspapers, but they aren't curious. Now, if you're not curious and you're not asking questions, you really can't have any of those jobs. So I think in changing the culture, we need to have people who are going to ask the questions and really demonstrate that they can act without fear or favor. I think, just looking back, we need to also look at many issues. I'm glad that our new president has raised the issue of, how are appointments made to boards? In fact, the appointments that were made on ESCOM and Transnet were shocking. You didn't know who these people were. It was no fit and proper test. And whilst I think we make a big thing about getting security vetting, and I hate the word security, I'm saying, can we just do vetting for honesty? Just see if the guys, are honest, and they crook people, and they clearly don't qualify. Before you look at fancy things like security, which anyway seems to have other objectives other than what they're supposed to do. I think the whole concept in our anti-money laundering legislation on politically exposed persons, we call it PIPs here. But I think we need to step that up, because those who embark on state capture are always politically connected. And how you deal with that, I think, is going to be quite critical. So I think when you look at the preventive mechanisms, the appointment processes, the issue of the interface, as the National Development Plan brought out, between the political and the administrative is quite important. Public servants who speak up actually get fired. It shouldn't be so easy when people are standing up for the right thing that they get fired. We need to set up institutions that protect your public servants, that you don't encourage yes men or yes woman culture, which really was there. And obviously, if such accounting officers and so on don't act against corruption, they should be charged first. But having done that, I think politicians also get away and say, no, it was the accounting officer that did this and not me. So I think that there's a lot of sort of governance reforms which we could put in place. I think that there are also design issues. There's some obvious things like approval processes. For example, someone who approves mineral rights. We've had a situation where there's rampant corruption. Surely there needs to be a proper governance over that. One needs to look at the integrity of those processes. So I don't think that we need very fancy solutions. But I also think, to end off, that we should have regular lifestyle audits. Senior public servants like me, politicians should be subjected to annual lifestyle audits, and I think that those sorts of mechanisms can pick up a lot of the potential problems that we have and stop there for now.
Well, that was terrific. Could I just ask a follow-up question? Do you think there is the capacity in the Treasury, properly led, and under a decent president we have now, to actually carry forward this task? Is there the capacity? Or is the Treasury being denuded and damaged?
Look, the Treasury has lost a lot of people, it's a problem, but I never take capacity as a problem. I think it's become an excuse in South Africa. I think that we can gain capacity if the political will is there. And I think the whole issue, yes, we might need more powers to subpoena and so on, because we can't, we rely on people volunteering information. We don't have really any power to investigate. But I think that, yes, there's a mountain of reports, but which need follow-up by people, the Hawks and so on, who have the investigative powers to actually develop a case, and the National Prosecuting Authority, which actually acts and doesn't sleep on a job.
By the way, I think we should, Sibusiso, the director of the school, I think we should get Momo back to talk when he doesn't have a tyrannical chair and is able to talk in some detail about these issues, and perhaps you might be willing to engage with some of the NGOs, the corruption watchers and so on here, to talk some of this through in detail, because I think it's been very valuable. Do you agree with what's been said this evening? So our final, but not at all the least speaker here, who I know, just knowing him, is going to give me a hard time as a chair, I just know that, is Bonong Mohali, whose Business Leadership South Africa. It's fantastic you've joined us here this evening, Bonong. Welcome.
Isn't it amazing, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hold it close.
That even though we had a moment to celebrate last night, that we couldn't for two reasons. One, because the work at hand is so big, 1,001 challenges that are confronting us, but also because we just can't afford to celebrate. But nonetheless, I think all of us, a round of applause that the thief is gone. The next task is how do we start the difficult task of state building, of capacity building. Because unfortunately where we are, public administration is worse off than it was when we inherited a technically bankrupt apartheid system. And for you to appreciate that, I'll go back to the definition of state capture. But secondly, we also have state-owned enterprises, some of the bigger than net asset values of countries that have been totally bankrupted. And I'll use Eskom as an example. Here's an entity that has a debt in October of last year of 471 billion. Now it's moving towards 500. State guarantees of 350 million, 295 they've already used. They need to come within a matter of days with $1 billion US, as 20 to 23 billion, just to meet their covenants to the banks, the commitments they've made. And yet we had a CEO who had the audacity to say, we are making so much money at Eskom that we can afford to finance the nuclear deal, which is $1 trillion. Thirdly, it said that not President-elect Cyril Ramaphosa now has a leadership that technically is under prosecution. And that's one of the things that he has to deal with as a matter of agency. And then, of course, lastly, is how we continue as business to be awake to the fact that we celebrated when we got the best constitution in the world. We had Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela as a saint president. When we had a thief, we didn't know how to deal with this thief. So the lesson for us is how do we ensure that we never ever get disengaged, that we become part of a vibrant, active citizenry in civil society, not only to hold the executives accountable, but to be involved even at the policy development stage. We haven't said much about state capture, but we've seen how it manifests. And if you understand the DNA, the antecedents of state capture, it is truly extraordinary that one, we could have purposefully willfully, deliberately repurpose state-owned enterprises to benefit not the 58 million South Africans, but the Gupta and the Zuma family. That number two, we embarked on this project of creating parallel but nonetheless weak governance, because state capture does not thrive where there is good cooperative governance. Thirdly, that we've created a shadow state where not even a cabinet is finally accountable. We created sexy things like interministerial committees. And one such minister even lied to say, I'm chairperson of such, and cabinet resolved to institute a commission of inquiry into why the 4 banks closed the Gupta accounts. That's where the focus was. Fourthly, it's how we even legitimized rent-seeking. Otherwise, how do you explain a bankrupt ESCOM prepaying 600 million to the Geta Gupta-owned, a private entity, and giving them a 1.6 billion guarantee to buy another private company called Optimum Co. Lastly, the prize has always been the capture of national treasure. Our pride and joy. This was amongst the world-class institutions that we built with effectiveness and efficiency. For 2 reasons they wanted to capture it. One, because last year, National Treasury collected 1.144 trillion South African rands. And the PIC is the largest asset manager in the continent, with now 1.9 trillion rands assets under management. And of course, capturing individuals would like to get their dirty hands onto that. I didn't give you any trouble.
I'm sure I speak for all of you. The panel has been absolutely great on time. And I think, given all the people on the panel, and we're very privileged to have such a distinguished panel, could talk for a long time with great authority and interest all of us. I think it's been absolutely great that we've got this expertise together. So very shortly, I'm going to ask whether any of you want to ask any questions. If you want to make a point, because very few questions are actually questions today. If you want to make a point, if you could keep it brief, because we've got a lot of people here and a lot of interest. Who can I hear from first? Paul, I'm going to call you in a minute. Anybody else like to speak? Yes, Yuvan Naidu, is it? If you could, everybody explain your name and who you are.
Sure. My name is
Hold the microphone really close.
Thank you. My name is Yuvan Naidu. I also serve as an exec in residence at the Wits Business School and a visiting lecturer. Always a great pleasure to be at Wits, but what I wanted to just share point-wise is one of the elements at the Wits Business School that we've shared for many years in terms of engaging the students is that management is not always about the black and the white of what's right and wrong. We really have a compass to know that when someone asks you directly for a bribe, it's wrong in any book. But it really is about how you manage in the gray areas when it becomes a slippery slope. And to the students here and the young leaders, it really is the DNA of training yourself to have that radar of when something is in that gray area, the facilitation fee of traveling across Africa that people often talk about. When that radar goes up, how does your training and experience and examples and role models that you draw on give you the courage? The other point we often talk about, which came up, and it's really great to hear, from the Treasury, and you've made it at so many forums over the last few years, Isma, is the culture that supports the ability for folks on the ground to be brave enough. Because if you don't have that culture of support, it fades. I'll make one other quick point in this area of grey, and that is about data. My day job is at Thomson Reuters as head of financial institutions. And what I want to point out is that there are a number of institutions talking about data, and the UK, as an example, is leading that. Financial Information Sharing Partnerships, FISPs. We all are going to hear more about that, because these entities or folks that operate in the grey area rely on agencies not cooperating. So FISPs are really taking off worldwide of how agencies cooperate, the holders of information, banks with legal authorities for poaching, human trafficking, and ultimately fraud. And it needs support from government for legislative certainty, it needs trust, and it needs governance. So the lesson for me is in South Africa, let our agencies not operate separately? How do you bring them together? How do we share information? Because today's data world with this, if you were at the Saxon World Shebeen and deny it, people know. And how do you bring that data together to really bring the fight to money laundering and state capture so that the facts really emerge using today's oil, which is data? Thank you.
I'd like to bring in Johan Boysens, who was a former head of the Hawks in KZN until he ran into trouble. I think you've had a bit of trouble with Logan Lovells, Johan, haven't you?
Indeed, I have.
Tell us succinctly about it.
Allow me a small indulgence. Never feel I'd seen the day in a pre-apartheid and a post-apartheid policeman that I would be sharing a stage here with yourself, being a Springbok supporter. In those days, Wits University was a persona non grata, and I didn't think I would see the day that I would work with a person like Robert McBride. Indeed, we've become friends. About 5 years ago, I started a corruption investigation in KwaZulu-Natal with a business associate of the President's son. And for my sins, during the process, I was actually approached, and they offered me a bribe of 2 million rand, and we set up a sting operation. They paid me 1.43 million in the morning. They were supposed to give me 1.5, but they shortchanged me. So we arrested the colonel and the police who had delivered the money, and subsequently the businessman was arrested as well. Needless to say, I was told to stop the investigation, which I refused. Later on, I suffered the same fate as Paul and Sarah. I was arrested on 2 occasions on trumped-up charges. I've been to court 7 times. On each occasion, I won with cost. My problem currently is the capture of the judiciary, not the judiciary per se, but the prosecuting authority. The very same people that repeatedly arrest people like Sarah, like Paul and myself, and even Gary Nell, who prosecuted Jackie Salebi a couple of years ago, are the same police officers, and the same advocates are involved. So I would also like to make a suggestion that we lobby for a judicial commission of inquiry into the independence and the function of the National Prosecuting Authority. Get back to Hogan and Roberts. After I was arrested on 2 occasions, and after I had been exonerated by the courts and a protracted disciplinary hearing where I was also exonerated, and the National Commissioner of Police at the time was lambasted, I was given a letter to cite reasons why I should not be dismissed from the police. I had that, went to court and had an interdict against the National Commissioner then, but the lawyers used at the time were Hogan's and Lowell's. And what I found it strange at the time is the police are supposed to use a state attorney and not work directly through attorneys of firms of attorneys. In this particular case, they did work through this particular company. I also opposed them successfully in court. And I must add, on those 7 occasions that I took them to court, 2 years ago, the litigation against myself, McBride and Omar Jomat, that cost the taxpayers 17 million. I suspect it's over 30 million as we speak. Thank you.
By the way, I should just, you reminded me when you mentioned the Springboks. I have been deluged with emails on my parliamentary email in London from people who say, congratulations for what you're doing on state capture, but I hated what you did on the Springboks. And I reply to them saying, actually the values are exactly the same that I was applying, and I'm proud of what I did in stopping the Springboks, just as I've been proud to assist people here in dealing with state capture. Anyway, enough of me. Any other questions from the rear? Yep.
Thank you. My name is Salman Khan, social entrepreneur and human rights activist. I'm amazed what I've been listening and what I'd like to actually share with you is something is amiss here. And that is like you asking for the action, how to ensure and does not happen again. And one of them is international relation. And we looking at South Africa, Dubai relationship, Hong Kong, US, and also the Singapore. But we're missing out very, very fundamental something here. It's India. I mean, the Guptas was not just three-brother catering. It was definitely the Indian, the whole state was behind. If you look at it, the Indian, the ANZ, the editorial, the New Age editorial was written in New Delhi, not in South Africa. The VSF, which is your home affair, the agency, it is also owned by the Guptas. So I think why we letting off India so nicely here, why we letting them off the hook, why the State Bank of India was implicated, the Bank of Baroda was implicated, the Denel India was formed to transport out the nuclear, the missiles are from South Africa, and the LR, the Denel LR, the laser company, was formed by the Guptas. So I think there is a lot more that we should be looking into, the Indian government role that has been played. The Gupta, if it was the US citizen who was involved in a state capture, will be pointing finger toward the USA. But here, the citizen of the India is hugely implicated, and nobody pointing out the finger toward the Indian government. So, and that is, I think that is like what I'm worried about it. When the 17 minister with the Guptas landed illegally at the waterproof airport base, we as a nation, we should be demanding an apology from the Indian government. And also, I'm not worried about what was landed. I'm worried about what's takeoff illegally from South Africa to India. So I think we need to give a look at that.
Thanks very much for that. I'd like to ask Ismail and anybody else on the panel to just comment briefly on the international side to this. What could an active treasury, what powers do you have to require foreign regulatory authorities, foreign governments, to assist in capturing the money, bringing the money back? It's been a long day. What sort of things need to be done to try and trace that money? When we heard from Euban that actually there's e-discovery, and Tara, you talked about artificial intelligence and so on, what bring you in. What would you say is the essence of what needs to be done on the international front by the South African government?
Okay, look, I'm not sure on to actually get the funds back, but to get the information. For example, our anti-money laundering agency, the FIC, they would have a sort of memoranda of understanding and relationships with other similar, what's called FIU units, okay, to get the information. Similarly, the tax authorities here can get info from the tax authorities from elsewhere. Now that you've got this country-by-country reporting, it's even easier to get some of that information. So getting the information from many jurisdictions is easy, but there are jurisdictions, Dubai being one of them, where it's very difficult to get that info. And I think also just our regulators are not used to using it. When they've had these memos of understanding, we've been saying to them, guys, you must at least use it every year. If you don't use it and you leave it for a big case, then you have to crank up the engine, you have to get to know people. And in fact, when you go to these forums like FATA, you need to make friends with people who are your peers so that when there's a problem, they know who you are. Okay. And in fact, you can get quite a lot of information, even informally. The other thing, and to be cheeky, lots of politicians here say they don't have accounts in Dubai. I say, can't we ask them all to give us a power of attorney for someone to go and fish whether there are accounts in their name, even where we don't have agreements, okay? If you're a clean politician or clean public servant, I'm sure you won't be afraid to check whether there's an account for you, and so on. So I think there's many mechanisms. I think on actual recovery, obviously that gets Interpol and so on. I'm not really, I don't know how you would actually get that, because I'm not a lawyer, so
Ismail, you've intrigued me on one point. Are you saying that there should be a new code of conduct for all ministers and members of parliament, let's say?
And public servants.
And public servants. that you have to be prepared to have your account to be checked whether you have an account in Dubai. Is that what you said?
Not only Dubai. I think that your employers should know all your accounts. There should be lifestyle audits and so on, separate from security vetting. And if you are clean, why wouldn't you be transparent about it and allow yourself to be examined?
Very interesting. Tara, do you want to add anything on that?
I mean, I just think there are a number of tools that are available available immediately to a government to set up a global investigation straight away to identify and to then start the process of seizing assets. I mean, you talked a little bit about, there's e-discovery, there's just a whole lot of, combined with working with lawyers, setting up, an investigation globally can be done in a day. And with the right structures in place and the right support. So, in a way, I don't think one should necessarily delay till you've formed the relationships with or rekindle relationships in a way, because assets disappear very quickly or are moved and so on. So you need to be acting pretty fast to catch them, and sometimes it's worthwhile working with private sector organisations who have got the technology, capacity, global reach to be able to do it straight away.
You raised private sector organisations, and we deliberately invited KPMG and McKinsey here this evening because they have a lot of the expertise. And they should be using it, and I think they're beginning to think about this, actually using it to help us do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. What wanted to add to?
Yes, I just wanted to, I'm not so much in the financial institutions, but more on the transparency and honesty of civil servants. And I just wanted to give an example of what is lacking and what needs to happen. It's an example, the very close to capturing the judiciary in South Africa. A woman called Leona Turan was appointed as a constitutional court judge quite recently. No political party even vetted her. No, she never, she was never questioned. There was no sort of investigation into who she was. I'll tell you who she was. When Zuma was facing the 783 charges of fraud, she was the High Court judge. At the same time she was sitting on that bench, she was a co-director in a company with Michael Hulley, his one legal advisor, and a co-director in another company with his other legal advisor, Jerome Brawns. And she allowed that case, that fraud case, to be postponed for 7 to 8 months, so that by the time he came back to court, he would be president. Now, we need to really look at how do we vet the people that are protecting our criminal justice system.
Very interesting. Right, I want to bring in David Lewis from Corruption Watch. And Paul, if you just pass that to him, and then I want to bring in Paul a little way down the line.
Thank you.
If any others indicate, you'll catch my eye.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to correct one misapprehension. And that is our principal anti-corruption statute is the prevention and
Do you mind standing up, David?
is the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, which is actually a much more robust piece of legislation than either the Bribery Act or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It has all the extraterritorial jurisdiction that those two acts have, and in fact we're also a signatory to the OECD Convention Against the Bribery of Foreign Officials, but it's never been enforced, only on very minor occasions. But the Act also governs domestic corruption, and it has two provisions that neither of those acts have that are potentially very powerful. The one is it bans what are called facilitation payments. This is in the case of the Bribery Act as well, but not the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And if you look at the modus operandi of Gupta's capture of state-owned enterprises, you will see that on almost all occasions It's a very simple modus operandi on almost all occasions. A company, an unknown company, is inserted between the private sector company wanting the regulatory authority or the state or the big public contract, and the foreign company, the company inserted between them is what is paid effectively a facilitation payment, and it takes different forms. In the case of the McKinsey Trillion thing, it took the form of cutting them into a contract and then not doing any work. There were different forms in the SAA, multi-choice, Minister of Communications thing, but those payments here and that conduct here is unequivocally prohibited by the Act, but it's never been enforced. And the most far-reaching provision of the Act, which I've never seen in any other anti-corruption legislation, is that if you are, I think, what is called a person of authority, but basically a sort of manager or a mid-manager in the company, and you have reason to suspect, not proof, just reason to suspect knowledge of corruption, you are obliged to report that to the police on the pain of extremely serious criminal sanction. I think the penalty for not reporting is something like a 10 or 15-year jail sentence. Now, we've tried to enforce that. That's never once been prosecuted. We have tried to enforce that in relation to SARS. And Moyane, the commissioner of SARS, who basically knew very well and had been told that his 2IC, a man named Jonas Makwakwa, who is in charge of the, amongst other things, the transfer pricing regime in South Africa. And transfer pricing is principally the way in which cross-border flows of corrupt money happen. He knew that this person was stuffing his ATM at odd times of the morning with thousands, hundreds of thousands of rands of cash. This is the second in command of the South African Revenue Services, and he never reported him. In fact, he protected him. And so, our view, and we've laid charges against both of them, is that both are guilty of very serious criminal offence. The Hawks have never prosecuted him. So much so that we've asked for a certificate, I can't remember the Latin term, is something, a non-impossible certificate, that will give us the authority to prosecute that privately. And even though private criminal prosecutions are notoriously complex and notoriously difficult, in this case, the evidence is so clear that we believe that we would succeed in getting a successful private criminal prosecution. But I should just add to that, and I think along with the criminal justice authorities, which I think there is a priority to clean up, SARS is arguably the greatest victim of the whole Gupta enterprise. And it's for good reason that it is. I mean, I always remind people that the notorious American gangster Al Capone went to jail and died in jail, not for the murders he committed, but for the taxes that he evaded. And, if you read the Jacques Poe book, the SARS stands at the center of all of the Gupta enterprises and many other criminal enterprises like cigarette smuggling and human trafficking. And that's why it was so important to get Pravin Gordhan and to get the Treasury, was because of their hold over SARS. And every one of the people now who are being chased for these elaborate crimes could frankly be put into jail for tax problems, the whole lot of them. And personally, I don't care what they go to jail for, as long as they go to jail.
David, thanks by the way, and I think we should take the opportunity to really applaud Corruption Watch for the job. Paula Sullivan from Forensic for Justice, another brave NGO.
Thank you, Lord Hayne. When I opened dockets against Dudu Maeni several years ago, within a few weeks, she'd opened dockets against me, and she was assisted in that process by a law firm called ENS Africa. And ENS Africa and a guy called Nick Linnell received millions of rand of SAA money to open counter dockets against me, so that, and that was taxpayers' funds, by the way, because at the time they were receiving that money, SAA couldn't pay its bills. They, in fact, were declared technically insolvent. And then you have this horrendous situation where the cops that come and drag me off the plane are directed to do that by none other than the then head of Hawks, Burning and Lemeza. HSF, that's the Helen Suzman Foundation, launched an application to have his appointment set aside. And that application was deliberately dragged out for 3 years, or 2.5 years, by another law firm called Hogan Lovells, who are based in London. So when you get firms like Hogan Lovells and ENS Africa, we have to send a very clear signal out. And I'm calling upon all South Africans to boycott Hogan Lovells in South Africa and ENS in South Africa and the rest of Africa where the big firms are doing business. But that brings me to my question, Ishmael. If we didn't have Sean Abrahams as head of the National Prosecuting Authority, if we didn't have Bernie and Lemeza as then head of the Hawks, if we didn't have Paklani as the head of the police, if we didn't have Moyane running SARS with his sidekick Makwakwa, would it have been possible for the Guptas to capture the state in the way that they did?
There was a question right at the back. Over there. Sorry, yeah, with a hat on. With a hat on. Sorry, not right at the back, but nearly on.
Good evening. My name is Victor Fuyani. But I haven't not revealed much. I'm just a reporter. I've got the first question goes to the struggles toward himself. I'd like to know that why do you think our constitution fails its citizenry by failure to prescribe a referendum on issues above the ANC, so-called top 6 or NEC, on issues of national consequences and on issues of national consequence and interest, because it's not in the realm of the ANC per se, a top 6 among other considerations, when the issues at hand are affecting 55 million of South Africans. The second one being, do you think or do you believe is BEE a facade for state plunder by the well-connected? Because as it is, when it was promulgated, it was supposed to benefit all and sundry, but from the look of things, it has reached a certain ceiling, beyond which no one knows. And then to the Treasury gentleman over there, you said you get fired if you act. Have you ever acted and got threatened? 1. 2.
This is the last question.
Have you ever acted and got threatened? As an addendum to that, do you feel like the state-owned enterprises are in the weaker state in which they are because of the firing of those who act, thereby weakening them in order for corruption to take root or to find us in the state in which we are?
So, a quick answer from Mabito first of all, and then from Ismail.
I'm sorry, I just made the first question, I didn't quite get that. Constitution and...
Okay. Okay, what I was asking was, why do you think our constitution fails its citizenry by failure to prescribe a referendum on issues above the ANC, issues of national interest, as well as consequence?
Okay. By the way, after our Brexit referendum, I don't like them. And I mean that seriously. What was it?
Yeah, I'll be happy if somebody who knows better than me could answer the first question. I honestly don't know. not hearing.
Yes, Bud?
Yeah, but I'm not going to answer on the referendum. I agree with you, Peter, after Brexit. I don't think referendums are a good idea. But to answer the other questions, I think there's no doubt, when we sort of introduced the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act, we kind of designed it, we were very idealistic, sort of assuming that not everyone would be corrupt, that Parliament would be hold us to account, and certainly after 1994, there's no doubt the committees were very independent. But after the arms deal, slowly things started to change. They became less independent as MPs and so on. And I can go on about the need for electoral reform and so on. But the point I want to make on that model is, in the financial sector, after the global financial crisis, there's a term called stress testing for risk. So all the major banks, which are seen to be systemically important financial institutions, get tested for risk. Sometimes I think we should do stress testing for corruption. In other words, we didn't design the PFMA to say, what if the minister is corrupt, and the DG is corrupt, the board is corrupt, and the CEO is corrupt? How will the system still be able to prevent corruption, or slow it down, or do something? Okay. And I think that we need to do stress testing for that, so that our systems prove to be more robust. And in fact, our systems haven't proved to be too bad, except that they take a long time. So I do think that we need to review our legislation and our framework, so that in the event someone's really corrupt, something could happen. Now, when I heard our new president say, and given that he also drove the Constitution, and I think Judge Musaneki raised the issues, that the president has this unfettered right to make the appointments like the Hawks, the NPA, SARS, and so on, the governor of the central bank. And clearly, you need to have a system that can at least check that if the president makes bad appointments, these could be stopped. Okay. Now sometimes I think in our public service we neither fish nor fowl. We are the UK model where your public servants are sort of remain and are independent of the political side, and neither are we in the US, where if you are a political appointment, there's clear processes to get you there. So shouldn't we be looking at issues that once the president appoints, perhaps there should be some sort of confirmation process? And in fact, the Chief Justice himself went through. So I think that we need to design mechanisms so that for the bad. So when bad appointments are made, bad processes, that we could be protected from those. So I have no doubt that had good appointments been made, it would have been much harder for the Guptas to have looted the way they did. One thing is for sure, I think the Guptas were brilliant. How they tested their model properly with SARA computers, and how they upscaled it, how they knew if you went to the state-owned entities, Treasury wouldn't even see those things. And they clearly designed a system. In terms of people being infected, if you look at our Chief Procurement Office, which Praveen Gordon had helped to set up, people like Kenneth Brown had to have bodyguards for the last year or two of his time in the Treasury. So yes, we have had evidence of that, but let me say, despite that, people have spoken up. Even where we sit, let's say there's tax confidentiality. So we write to SARS and say, look, we know you can't tell us about the affairs of the Geta, tax affairs, but do you know, Minister Goram raises issues of these, I think there's 73 transactions, there's these rehabilitation funds, and we trust that you're making sure that not a cent was touched, because if they were, then you need to get your 28% tax plus the 28 times 2 penalty, and I trust that you're looking into it, because in the future there's a Judicial Commission of Inquiry, they must look. They can't say they didn't know. So you create the kind of basis for people to act. So I'm not saying that you have by any means a foolproof system, but I think all these sort of checks and balances are critical if you want to guard against corruption.
Thanks very much. A question down at the front, and then there's a woman right at the back there.
He asked about BE.
Oh, sorry, yes, over here. Babusa, you wanted to come in about BE, sorry. Yes.
The question about BE, I think the intentions in setting up the BE legislation were very good and very justified. Democracy comes at a time when the people of South Africa are unequaled by legislation of the past. It would have been very unstable, even for the white people, to continue at that level if there was no infusion of a black middle class. What went wrong with the BE is that those who crafted the policy for BE came round and joined the queue to be beneficiaries of the policy that they themselves had enacted. And very unfortunately, business, being often so short-sighted, so short-termed, did not take advantage of this to identify people who could add value to their businesses. And there were quite a number of people in institutions who had tried business even in the times of apartheid, and partner with them and get them into their companies. They looked for politicians because of their connectedness. So you ended up with a name that we respect very much. Becomes billionaire he is today. He was a very important person close to Mandela, Secretary General of the Saki Matozoma, Tokyo Sewal, and many others. They must forgive me for mentioning them alone. But I think also it's the short-termism of business, who wouldn't mind throwing money at people who they think are close to political power in order to maintain their status quo. So this needs to be changed. Lots of people can provide value to companies.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne Duvenage from ARTA. I think one of the things we'd like to point out is that the state-owned institutions has been the plunder pot. I don't think that's any secret, but the modus operandi has been to revalue assets that makes Steinhoff look like child's play. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that what Steinhoff have done is good at all. They need to be held accountable. But when you see Sanral, for instance, revalue its assets by 140% in 1 year, and IFRS does allow you to do that if it is justified and you are a trading organization that can justify your assets as a tradable asset. But a state-owned institution, when it behaves in this way, needs to be looked at very carefully. And we asked Treasury, we've even asked the Auditor General, how do you justify that? And then in the next year, from 2007 to 2008 and 2009, they revalue their assets again by 750%. From 30 billion rand to 250 billion rand. And then 2 years later, the roads have not increased from 16,000 kilometers by another 20%. And so they continuously revalue these assets to make the balance sheets look good, against which they borrow funds. And the same thing happens if you go and look at all the state-owned institutions. Every single one of them, around about the same time between 2007 and 2009, the asset values climb rapidly. Eskom, Transnet, Denel, Sanral, all of them. And against that, they borrow. They borrow massive funds, and these projects never end. And so we see Ngula going from 8 to 30 billion rand. We see Medupi, Kusile, all of these projects never ending. And we can assure you that the companies on the other side of the corruption coin that are funding these asset construction projects are making billions of rands. So we would like an investigation done into exactly what's happening, because there is where you'll find the corruption and the modus operandi. And the boards of those organizations, those state-owned entities, every single one of them, the finance managers, all of them need to be held accountable and spend their time in the dock answering the question.
My name is Matsabo Brwane. I'm a property specialist. To Lord Lee, and thank you very much for the ruling date of the
So you'll need to speak up, sorry.
we thank you very much for the role you played during the apartheid period, and then have a blessed birthday tomorrow. And having said, I think as a lay person, your attack against Logan Hoban, I think is unfair because you seem not to provide anyone with the evidence or support that about the allegations that they support in corruption. And it seems that your allegations to Hogan Logan doesn't have any proof, and you don't even talk anything about the other law firms who are supporting ESCOM, Prada, and SABC.
Right. What I think, just briefly, in my own self-defense, in quite a lengthy speech in the House of Lords, I laid that evidence out, and none of it's been disputed by Hogan Lovells, except to call it hogwash. And then Forensics for Justice published, I think it was 18 pages?
19.
19 pages of details. And Hogan Lovells has never responded to that, despite being invited to do so. And my advice to Hogan Lovells, based on the experience of KPMG and Bell Pottinger and McKinsey and so on, is own up and come clean, and then you can be part of the solution, not the problem. So that's my answer to your point. Right. I'm not going to be able to bring everybody in because we're getting towards the end of our time and I need to bring the panel in right at the end. But right at the back, the glasses. Keep holding your hand up so the microphone finds you.
Hi, good evening. Mashima Lima from Business Report and Personal Finance. I have a question for the entire panel. I would like the term white monopoly capital. I think that's a very popular term, probably second to state capture in the country. I would like to know your thoughts on the narrative of white monopoly capital, and to what end do you think South African politicians will continue to use that narrative to deflect from state capture?
Right, I think that's a question for the panel at the end, if that's okay. And then there's a colleague just holding his hand up there. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Mawane Kotan.
If you could stand.
Sorry, my name is Mawane Kotan.
Streaming as well.
Okay, good. Given that Professor Oja said in the beginning that one of the causes for corruption is things like uneven wealth distribution and ethnic and tribalistic and racial separation, do you think it would be a worthwhile cause to look at investigating corruption prior to '94? It's not really a worthwhile cause, given that so much, based on Van Vuren's book about what Armsco was doing in various other state entities. Do you think it's worthwhile opening up those books as far as back as that? Thanks.
Right, so it's in the front here.
I'm an activist, been an activist around Marikana and Kazuma Moscow. But I want to talk in my capacity as a filmmaker in relationship to Marikana, because there we received the evidence leaders and defense teams tens of gigabytes of digital information, thousands of pieces of evidence, lots of documents and so on. And I think now, if we are unable to get ahead of the curve in terms of the weight of digital evidence that comes forward. I mean, a joint friend of ours, lawyer friend, was telling me just the other day, a cell phone that was subpoenaed for evidence produces 13,000 pages of information. Now, you know, we're going to start looking at laptops and servers and so on. This is a massive amount of work. And I don't think we know that the law enforcement agencies, the best of them in the world, are being swamped by this amount of digital evidence that's being presented to them. We need independent organisations. We also know the State of Capture report. Hundreds of thousands of rands was spent on using the private sector in this regard. So I think we need an independent body that's properly funded in order to ensure that we can sift through these terabytes, hundreds if not thousands of terabytes of digital evidence.
Two more questions, one right at the back, and the woman in the light blue jersey there, or dress, I can't see.
Hi, I'm Chiriti. I'm a nobody, no role, no anything. Just an undergrad, and compliments to Mr. Mafuso Msima. If it wasn't for him when he was the Director General of Home Affairs, I wouldn't have went to school and graduated. So compliments to him and everything. Oh, that's when they used to have a problem at Home Affairs, so he solved mine. Basically, my question is, I won't repeat what the panel said. I've been here and I heard what they said. But there's something concerning. I know that the state capture, there's a commission that is going to be happening. So with white monopoly capital and the Stellenbosch boys, you can see the Capitec, the Steinhoff, the PIC lost a lot of money with that. What's happening? I think when the state of capture was happening, when the Guptas were busy looting South Africa, the other guys in business were also looting the other money which people were investing in. What's currently happening there? We see Viceroy producing research reports of Steinhoff and Capitec, and now we hear that Investec wanted to release a report with regards to Naspers, but Naspers is busy negotiating for that report not to be released. Are we having a collapsing country in both the public and the private sector? And who's going to investigate the private sector?
Very interesting. By the way, one of the questions your question prompted my thought that I have a friend who's a banker in the audience, and he told me that there's one big iceberg of corruption in South Africa, and that's the Guptas, but there are lots of other icebergs. And we focus too much on them, and we're not looking at the other icebergs, what is above the water and what's not below the water. The last question over there, yeah.
My name is Nael Beckham. I've spent part of my career working in the public service. Firstly, I think it's been an incredible event, and thank you very much to all those involved in tonight's event. I want to make a point about how we rebuild the public service. It's clear from everything that everybody has said tonight that rebuilding the public service is a key task that we all face. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And partly it's to do with the caliber of people that we can attract into the public service. And it's partly to do with systems in the public service. And I wanted to say, perhaps direct this to Momo, about the Public Finance Management Act. I feel like I laboured under the Public and Municipal Finance Management Act for many years. And I think in a way it gives us the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, it makes it quite difficult as a sort of honest public servant to do your job. And on the other hand, even with all the procedures it puts in, it doesn't actually stop corruption. And I think that's because it is process-driven rather than substance-driven, particularly in the way that the supply chain management regulations are written. It's all about these very, very elaborate committees. And each year, the regulations came in and they became more and more elaborate in terms of the processes you had to go through to try and procure even quite small things. When people are determined enough, they can overcome all those procedural issues because they never really, in terms of those regulations, have to say anything about the substance. And in particular, you never really have to show that the company that you appoint as a public servant actually has the capacity to deliver what is asked. You just have to show that you've been through sufficient of the committee cycle. So I think that the LFMA and the PFMA require quite deep reform, and that reform needs to be less about procedure and more about substance.
Just before I bring the panel in, I'm going to ask the question that I've been asked to ask by somebody who is an expert but doesn't feel able to reveal himself or herself sitting in the audience amongst you. And it's this. It may be something I don't really understand, but it may be that the panel will be able to help me. Is it possible to bring a civil case using the Mareva injunction against anyone connected with bank accounts such as, for example, Oakway or Trillion, and freeze those? Is that possible to bring?
No.
Well, Paul, tell me in 30 seconds why it's not. Only 30 seconds. I know a lawyer finds it very hard to answer.
South African law doesn't allow Mareva injunctions for that purpose, because the closest to a Mareva injunction in South Africa that you could use doesn't allow the overcoming of the constitutional right to privacy, so there has to be a third party involved. So it'd be very, very hard unless you can put together. Mareva injunction is also an ex parte action, so it's very, very hard to convince the court, and the courts will err on the side of safety because of the potential abuse of constitutional rights.
Right, well there you have it. Sarah Jane, if you respond on behalf of the panel first, please. What do you want to say rather than the whole
I think we had a huge victory today, and we're going into another new South Africa. The hard work is just beginning, I think, and keep supporting the civil society. Keep supporting your NGOs. Do what you can to make a difference. And then also I just wanted to maybe mention, we had an idea in terms of these companies we've been talking about, a functioning team where they can give resources like auditing and litigation support and that kind of thing. Just to atone for their sins and to support the lack of capacity that we're having at the moment. But yeah.
Khalid?
Yeah. We still have to go back. We've talked about all the problems that have happened that is associated with Gupta Gate and Zuma's family and all. That's not the issue. It's just a symptom. We must go back to the root cause of the problem, which has to do with where society sits now. Do people, somebody said monopolist capital and radical economic transformation. Where is it coming from? On which side do you stay? Do you sit with the radical economic transformation, or do you sit with white monopolist capitalism? What does that mean? It means there is fission, there is fractionalization in society. It has to be addressed. How do we address them? We have programs in place. We must go back there. President Ramaphosa and his team must begin to look seriously into programs that were put in place like BEE that are supposed to begin to address these. Make sure that they are addressed correctly. The intentions were right, the implementation was wrong, the target was wrong. Those need to be addressed. People need to be educated. The economic level, income levels of South Africans need to be brought to some equilibrium. This is not communism where everybody will be at equal level economically, but it needs to be some sense of belonging, some sense that I'm part of it, I have access to it. And what I do as a living, which is education, is one way of equalizing that. It's one way of redistributing income without actually taking away from people who have worked hard to get it. So government cannot shy away from that. And civil society, where government organs are not working effectively to address that, civil society is very good at keeping the government foot to the fire. Other civil societies must be involved. If you think your interest is not being addressed, we should. And the university is also doing a very good job of having this kinds of thought leadership to bring the issues to the fore. We must continue doing that. Civil society, hold government accountable. The fundamentals cannot be ignored. Otherwise, we'll be deluding ourselves about solving problems. We talk about what has happened and the religious nature of it.
Thank you. Tara.
So, I mean, I think we are about to enter a fantastic new period, which of institutional renewal. I think one of the great things about the transfer of power today is that is to say and to celebrate that the Constitution has actually stood the test, and I think all South Africa should celebrate that. And yes, in comments that I've said about actually how we actually, one of the things we wanted to talk about is how we actually get a culture of probity back into South African society, both government and private sector. And I think we can learn lessons from other countries across the continent. And Kenya has a fabulous example of where their entire judiciary was required to reapply for their jobs in public and televised. And the NGOs and civil society put all the judges to the test and challenged them on their previous judgments, particularly the corrupt ones. So I think that's a good thing. In terms of greater transparency, Scandinavian business people and government have their tax returns published online. Why not? Part of the institutional renewal could be to push for far greater transparency. If not revealing your bank accounts, but but certainly that you are actually a contributing member of society and pay your tax and on time. And finally, just in terms of, I do agree, I was aware of the Corruption Act, the corruption legislation in South Africa, but to just reiterate that for civil society where it's not being implemented, there is a host of things that you can do to hold corporates to account around the world for this probity. So not just here, it's elsewhere. You can hold companies to account. And that would be my final comment.
Great. Mabusa.
If you ask me the question how I feel today, I would say really very hopeful, very expectant. Today is so much better than yesterday. We do have a situation where there is, let's not assume that anybody, any institution, any organization is perfect. Let's look at this glass, to use this fraction, as half full. Let's do all we can to really stand behind the efforts that has been achieved with a lot of work by so many people. I'm really glad to be part of people who are in the ANC called veterans, because I tell you, we were outlawed almost for joining the rest of society because the ANC had isolated itself from the people and become supplicants to the Guptas and people like that. I feel better than yesterday.
Can I just briefly add that there's an enormous mood for self-criticism in South Africa at the moment, and I think that's right. Don't underestimate, and I say this as a sort of semi-outside observer, don't underestimate the fantastic resilience of this society. Fantastic resilience. When you together made sure that things changed from the absolutely terrible position they've been in. Now there's a long way to go, but do not underestimate yourselves and have confidence about the future.
Yeah, for me, I'm very hopeful, but I think we must carefully look at the past and learn our lessons and build the institutions and build them better than we did say 20 years ago. Secondly, I think certainly when it comes to corruption, whether it's Steinhoff, whether it's Naspers, whether it's the Guptas, whoever it is, we must not act selectively, and we need to, the authorities need to act without fear or favor. With regard to the issues of white monopoly capital, certainly I think the issue of transformation is important, and certainly much needs to be done to get more, to deal with problems like inequality and to deal with economic transformation. But we also need to be careful. Many who, the same viceroy talked about something wolf in sheep's clothing. They're making money shorting. So be careful about people who throw stones like that, okay? Because they may be the wolf. Similarly, many who use the arguments of transformation, if it's not mass-based transformation and just narrowly based, be careful about that. Last night, the Exaro CEO gave evidence in Parliament. Unfortunately, it was a time with all these other things going on, so I guess people weren't watching. But that was a black-owned company. And those who say they're fighting for real economic transformation actually made sure they didn't supply coal to Eskom because they wanted a certain family to do so. So, let's watch those wolves who hide under transformation and see where the money goes. If you follow the money, you'll see whether they are really interested in in transforming society. Lastly, I think, certainly I think a lot of our institutional arrangements, the auditing process, Hogan levels, all of those, some of their practices have been disgraceful, and I think that we should get them to pay back the money for the bad work they did, because what motivates them often is how much easy money they can make from institutions by acting for clearly the corrupt and using their degree of respectability to solve the issues.
So focusing a little bit on what needs to be done as business, we stand ready to share with the new administration what we call an emergency socio-economic recovery plan. Very practical things that can be done to ensure that we pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. If we scrapped the nuclear deal, we save ourselves R1 trillion that would have indebted our children. If we look at the Auditor General's report of just last year, 85 billion rand in just irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Over the last 10 years, on average, it's 80 billion. Imagine how many schools, how many indigent students, and how many homes we could have built. If we are very deliberate about budgeting for free higher education for the indigent, and we prioritize that because we know that it's a way of transcending social classes, as it were, of course we'll find the money. National health insurance, laudable, must be implemented. Access to healthcare, it's a human right, but it needs to be budgeted for appropriately so that indeed it does not disadvantage the majority of people. Terms like radical economic transformation and white monopoly capital will always find resonance until and unless we can ensure that poverty does not have a black face. That 24 years into democracy, a majority of South Africans are saying, I've not personally benefited from this democracy dividend. So as business, we are absolutely determined that we're driving only 3 agendas. One is this notion of inclusive economic growth. Because if you don't grow, very soon you'll be talking about the redistribution of poverty, not wealth. And transformation. Because if we don't win on transformation as a business, we might as well just pack up and go. The second, it's about how together we create sustainable jobs to give our people dignity and self-esteem. There's no honor in queuing as one of the 17 million social grant recipients. Lastly, it's about ensuring that we take issues of gender equality seriously. Because we know that when we put a smartphone in the hands of women, not only does their children's nutrition, education, and health improve, but that of an entire nation. Because when women's financial digital inclusion happens only by 10%, the gross national product of countries goes up by 2 percentage points.
Before I hand over to our director to close this evening, I just want to make 2 brief points. First of all, you all have this document on ideas for action. Have a think about it. Feed your ideas back in to the corruption watchers, the outers, and all the NGOs that are involved, and into the universities and business school here. Secondly, I just want to thank this fantastic panel. They've been absolutely great tonight, haven't they? I really want to thank them for being incredibly self-disciplined and at the same time contributing so much interesting stuff. I hope you feel like I do, that this has been a really significant evening, that we can now take it forward. I know there are plans in the school to have an expert seminar with NGOs and some of the companies that have the expertise to take the agenda forward and support Ismail Momriat and others in the government that want to take that agenda into practical action. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for being part of this. I'll hand over to the director to close the evening.
Thank you very much indeed, and indeed it has been a wonderful occasion, a great panel, and you've all been absolutely great. Please, the facilitator has been outstanding, and can we have a round of applause? I want to also ask Paul to...
Peter, when I was at your office in London, I noticed that you had a big poster on the wall. It was an election poster for 1994 for Nelson Mandela. We all know what happened to that. But I noticed there was a bit of space on the wall in the office. So we have a certificate of appreciation. It's awarded to Lord Peter Hayne of Neath. It's got today's date on it. I'll have to drop my glasses. For helping the citizens of South Africa to expose the dark underbelly of corporate greed and systemic corruption. With your help, we are better equipped to shake off the yoke of corrupt oppression that has affected the poorest of the poor in our communities. To be sure everyone can see where you got it, there's a nice little gift from Africa. And thirdly, and finally, to recognize what happened today with you, Lord Hayne, Sarah Jane sent out a tweet at exactly 6 o'clock when this session started. And the tweet is a reward of 100,000 rand, which is being offered for any person that provides information on the whereabouts of Mr. Gupta within the next 48 hours.
Further modest auditorium token of appreciation for the whole panel. And,
I don't think you.
We are very privileged to have you as another professor at Little School. So once again, thank you, and then we will all of you.
She was here. She was here, but she had to go and fetch Maddie from school. So, but Musa's kindly offered me Maddie a quote about it for a history project. So I've been gently sending him SMS saying, please, I know it's like crazy season at the moment. Well,
It'd be nice to get you guys around again. Yeah, you're going to move away from that lovely focus. Right, shut. The wrong person. Thank you. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you. I'll see you later.